Welcome to the World War I History Podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. We invite you to follow us on Twitter at MacArthur1880 or find the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial on Facebook.
Today, when most people think of the United States Marine Corps in World War I, they probably think about Belleau Wood. They don't tend to think of the role the Marines played in taking Blanc Mont in the Champagne sector in 1918. The French understood the importance of Blanc Mont and praised the Marines for this action, but World War I historians tend to devote just a sentence or a footnote to this battle. To share the story of the Marines at Blanc Mont, today we are joined by Lieutenant Colonel Peter F. Owen, United States Marine Corps retired, and Lieutenant Colonel John Swift, United States Marine Corps retired, co-authors of A Hideous Price, the 4th Brigade at Blanc Mont, October 2nd to 10, 1918. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And thanks to you and the MacArthur Memorial for having us on. We're tickled to be here.
Well, it is our pleasure. So set the stage for us. Start us off with an overview of the Champagne sector of the Western Front leading up to October 1918.
Okay, this is Pete, and I'm going to jump in and take a crack at that one. I think we could say that in 1918, the war had changed substantially. So most people think of World War I, especially the 3 years leading up to 1918, being trench warfare and static warfare. And we could, I think, fairly characterize 1918 as now we've broken the deadlock, and it's a war of movement and a year of decision. And the Germans had started recognizing the Americans were about to build up a large armory in France. They tried to knock the British out with a series of offenses up in the northern part of France near the English Channel in March through May, before the Americans had built up enough strength to tip the scales. And although these attacks were fairly successful, they hadn't really knocked the British out of the war like they hoped. And their last offensive had culminated at the end of May. And that was against the French northeast of Paris. And this is really what set the stage for the Marine action at Belleau Wood in June. Well, after that offensive had kind of petered out, the Germans mustered the strength for one more offensive in July. It wasn't as strong, and they had created a huge salient of vulnerability. And the Allies under French Marshal Ferdinand Foch had counterattacked, and the Marines led that counterattack along with several American divisions and many French divisions at the Battle of Soissons in July. And that offensive was highly successful, and it was followed up by another successful Allied offensive by the British up near Amiens. And so at the end of August, Foch kind of recognizes, hey, I think instead of building up an American army and waiting until 1919 to try and win this war, I think we could do it now. So at the end of August, he comes up to Pershing and he says, hey, I've got this great idea. I'm going to have the British continue their attack in the north, and I'm going to have you and Petain's French army attack down here on the right flank, on the right end of the Western Front. Well, that's a great idea. And he says, oh, but what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to move your army about 50 miles to the northwest from Saint-Mihiel, where you're getting ready to attack on 12 September. And I'm going to have you attack between the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest. And by the way, we're going to do it 12 days after you start your long-planned Saint-Mihiel offensive. And General John Pershing was not happy about this, and he thought it was not feasible. But after a little back and forth, he agreed to go in, and he agreed to go ahead. And the American army is now going to fight the largest battle of its history there in the Meuse-Argonne. Well, on its left flank, the French Fourth Army is going to be supporting that attack, and that will be the French main effort for this coming large Allied offensive. And they will be just to the west of the Argonne Forest, just on the left flank of the American Expeditionary Forces. And that's where this battle is going to take place, there in the Champagne region of France.
Okay. And what is the significance of Blanc Mont, and why are the French just so determined to take it? And if you could add a little about the terrain and weather of that particular sector, because you write in the book that it definitely favors the defenders.
Absolutely. Amanda, I'll take that question if you don't mind. And then picking up with Pete's eloquence there of describing really what happened in World War I on the Western Front from 1917 to 1918 up to October of that year, which is when Blanc Mont then will occur. So the German strategic aim was to knock the British out of the war in 1917, as Pete had related. As they did that as an economy of force measure, as they had been bled for 3 years of war, they had picked an alternative fallback position from which they would strike during the Kaiserschlacht of 1918. And that defensive line was called the Hindenburg Line. And so the Hindenburg Line then basically scored its way across the face of Europe or France. And that Hindenburg Line actually rests on top of Blanc Mont. And so the entire Allied offensive of 1918 to really then push the Germans out of the war and gain peace was to breach and then ultimately defeat the Germans beyond the Hindenburg Line. So in the Champagne region, the German defenses there on the Hindenburg Line actually run along the crest of Blanc Mont. In Foch's terms, he would have been referring to the region east of the city of Reims as the Les Monts, or the ridges. And so Blanc Mont is a ridge. It's about 200 meters high. The ridges to the east and west are actually a little higher than that. So Foch thought that he would be able to most likely breach the Hindenburg Line at the crest of Blanc Mont. So as we look at what will be the sector from which the 2nd Infantry Division will attack, and of course the 4th Marine Brigade as a portion of that 2nd Division, it's basically a corridor, if you will. And so that corridor is just under 3 kilometers wide. And at the base of the corridor is the ruins of a little village called Saint-Pie. And to the north of that corridor, beyond the Hindenburg Line and beyond the crest of Blanc Mont, is a little village. Again, it's destroyed as well, a little village called Saint-Étienne. Between almost midway of those two villages runs the crest of Blanc Mont, 200 meters in height. Just north of that ridge is another little hillock, and just south of that ridge is another little hillock, which will kind of play out in the battle as intermediate objectives, if you will, on both 3 and 4 October. The Germans had spent about a year and a half building the Hindenburg Line. There are 3 main lines of resistance that run through the area of operations the 2nd Division will attack through. The basically referred to as main line of resistance 1, 2, and 3. 1 being on the hillock south of Blanc Mont, main line of resistance number 2 being along the crest of Blanc Mont, and main line of resistance number 3 being the little hillock just north of Blanc Mont and south of Saint-Étienne. Again, the Germans have been there for about a year and a half. It's a very well-established defensive position. It takes advantage of every minor fold of the terrain. As the trench system wends its way through the area, it will be revetted with concrete, machine gun emplacements, mean and warfare emplacements, and artillery positions. And of course, at this time in the war, the entire German defensive strategy is built on economy of force. There will be an outpost line, a battle zone, and a rear zone. The outpost zone really is in the 2nd Division's area of operations, that main line of resistance number 1. We'll talk a little bit about the Essen Trench, if you will, and it was really the outpost zone. The battle zone is main line of resistance number 2. It is the crest of Blanc Mont, and that is where the Germans will determine then to really hold the main resistance. And then the rear zone, from which then the reserves will attack or consolidate and then move and attack further, is main line of resistance number 3, that little hillock north of the Blanc Mont Ridge. In the 2nd Division's area of operations really are 4 primary German divisions. At this time in the war, the divisions are really at brigade strength, almost half strength as to when they would have started the war. So really the total of these 4 divisions are barely equal to 1 U.S. division. The German divisions are the 200th Infantry Division, the 51st Reserve Division, the 203rd Infantry Division, and the 3rd Guards Infantry Division. The 2nd Division's attack will mostly orient itself on the defensive positions of the 203rd and the 3rd. So hopefully that explains a little bit of what the terrain would have looked like. And of course, this is October. Average temperature is between 50 and 60 degrees, about 12 hours of daylight. It favors the defender simply because of the expanse of wide open terrain looking down on the attacker in well-established defensive positions.
Now, by 1918, the French army is absolutely exhausted. and the French end up asking for American troops to help take Blanc Mont. After Saint Mihiel, the U.S. Army's 2nd Division and then the relatively green 36th Division are attached to the French 4th Army under General Henri Gouraud. Now, some people might be confused by this because here we're talking about U.S. Army divisions when the podcast is supposed to be about Marines. But the 2nd Division is very unique, though. Can you tell us a little bit about its makeup?
Yes, thank you, Amanda. I'll take some of that question as well. I have to state that really remembering America declares war in 1917, the American Army, Navy, and at that time the Marine Corps is ill prepared for war. It takes them months to prepare. So as noted, the French have bled white as well as the British and the Germans, and the U.S. forces are just now getting to France. But the U.S. took almost a year to get ready to start moving. And so really in the effort to propel forces overseas in late 1917, any trained forces were an optimum to the U.S. military. And of course, a little bit of politics to play. You can't have a national or international crisis without involving the Marines, and certainly the Commandant of the Marine Corps offered his services to the Secretary of the Army. And of course, the President was more than willing to do that. So at the beginning, or when the war is declared, the Marines in total are some 13,000 men. And at the end of the war, it'll be about 75,000 men. So regardless of some historians' take that the Marines won World War I after Belleau Wood, certainly the numbers won't bear that out. In total, there will only be 1 brigade of Marines that will offer frontline service, and then there'll be another brigade, the 5th Brigade, that will kind of basically hold port duty, and they won't enter into combat. The 4th Marine, or the 4th Marine Brigade, actually starts with the mobilization of the 5th Marine Regiment, and that takes place on 4 August 1917. They actually will go overseas as an element of the 1st U.S. Army Infantry Division. And of course, the 1st U.S. Army Infantry Division is the 1st Division in France. The Marines will be a part of that as obligated by the Commandant of the Marine Corps to the Secretary of the Army. As more U.S. Army units get to France in late 1917, there becomes a curriculum of training with the French and the British. And the 5th Marine Regiment will find itself pulled out of the 1st Infantry Division. It will go to training separately, and the 1st Infantry Division will be folded out with 4 regiments of U.S. Army regulars. At that time, then, the U.S. Army starts to build, and they start to then what they call flag the 2nd Infantry Division. The 5th Marine Regiment will be the first portion of that, and then the 9th Infantry. And interestingly enough, a little bit of Marine Corps history in that Colonel Doyen, who is the regimental commander for 5th Marines, will be promoted to Brigadier General. He will be appointed the 1st Division Commander for the 2nd Infantry Division. Certainly not at the time of the Battle of Blanc Mont or even Belleau Wood, as he'll be recalled from service, but it's just a minor note that actually a Marine will be the 1st commander of the Infantry Division, although albeit for only a few weeks. While that's unfolding, the 6th Marine Regiment is stood up at Quantico. On 23 October, the 4th Brigade is actually assembled, and then it will become part of the 2nd Division late in November of 1917. And then it will transfer over to a U.S. Army command. So the 2nd Division is a little unique. It has 2 regiments of Marines and then 2 regiments of U.S. Army to fold out. And of course, with those 2 regiments of Marines, then is the 6th Machine Gun Battalion as well, which will be U.S. Marines.
At Blanc Mont, a Marine, Major General John Lejeune, will lead the 2nd Division. Now, he's not part of the 2nd Division at its inception. He's not part of it at Belleau Wood in June 1918 or at Soissons in July 1918. But he studied those actions, and he was very convinced that Pershing's AEF doctrine of open war was not going to work. And he's going to depart from that doctrine at Blanc Mont. Can you expound on this a little bit?
Yeah, I can take a crack at that. So this whole idea of open warfare was really embraced by all American officers in American Expeditionary Forces. And this is both Army and Marines. And everybody thought that, hey, our soldiers and our Marines are much better marksmen when it comes to the rifle, and they're independent, free citizens who have a lot of initiative, and they're able to make independent decisions. And so kind of our legacy from the Civil War and the Banana Wars really lends itself to an open style of warfare, of movement. But really, they hadn't defined what open warfare was, and they hadn't planned how they're going to conduct open warfare. They just knew they didn't want to do trench warfare, which is what those silly French and British have gotten themselves mired into for the last 3 years. So really, Pershing and all his officers believed we're going to practice open warfare, but then they hadn't had anything that was a modern doctrine that showed their officers, hey, here's how you're going to train your troops to do this, how you're going to direct them in battle to accomplish open warfare. But they did have some really good doctrine. They really had some great tactics, which they adapted from the French and the British, primarily the French in the 2nd Division. And they translated their manuals into English, and they practiced these after the division assembled there in January of 1918 in their training area in eastern France. The problem was when they finally went into action, the war had kind of moved out of the trenches. So these trench warfare tactics that they had been practicing weren't really applicable. And if they had had an open warfare doctrine and they had trained to it, they might have done a lot better at places like Belleau Wood and Soissons. So the Marines and the whole division had suffered. They had fought magnificently, of course, because the troops were enthusiastic and they were well led. But they had probably, I think you could argue, been mishandled and poorly trained, and it suffered awful consequences. So that's where the division had been before Lejeune took it over. Now, when Lejeune takes it over, he has an opportunity very few American commanders had during the war, which is to retrain after his initial actions. So the whole division retrains, and he puts out guidance, and he says, hey, listen, when we were using these trench tactics in our earlier actions, everybody was trying to rigidly apply them and not really make an estimate of what's going on, what's the situation like, and adapting them and showing any flexibility or any initiative. And he says, that's not what we're going to do in the 2nd Division. In the 2nd Division, what I want you to do is adapt to what you see, take the tactics that we've mastered. And he says that the use of rigid formations, rigidly applied in a prescribed manner, is forbidden. That's not what we're going to do. So the division gets an opportunity to retrain. Probably an even more important thing is the division's small unit leaders, from the platoon commanders up through the brigade commanders at every level, are much more experienced than their counterparts in other American divisions. So they've got this solid basis. And then when we get to Blanc Mont, well, as John just described, this battle is really sort of a set-piece trench warfare battle to which these early French tactics that they had mastered are very well suited. So because they've got experienced leaders at every level, and because they've got a tactical doctrine that's quite well suited to this particular situation, and because they're going to be benefiting from abundant and close continuous artillery support to support the infantry, at least on the first day, that they've kind of prepared for this fight very well under Lejeune's leadership.
What do we know about the relationship between French General Gouraud and Lejeune? When Lejeune learns that Gouraud plans at one point to break up his division to use it to reinforce French divisions at Blanc Mont, he really objects to this and he offers an alternative. Can you tell us a little bit about that relationship and then what Lejeune proposes?
Absolutely. I'll address that briefly. So we say relationship, and some people may have an interpretation that they were friends or they had some sort of social relationship. I would refer to it really as a command relationship. We don't know for certain that really General Lejeune ever really knew of Gouraud before this or had been in meetings with him before this. But what we do know is that really the chain of command in World War I is fragile, especially as the war continues. General Lejeune deserves compliments in his leadership style, and that you'll see several U.S. generals do this, that in the absence of orders or direct communication, whether that's via carrier pigeon, courier, or telephone communications, they'll go get information. They'll pull the information. And that's exactly what General Lejeune does. When he knows he's going to be assigned to the 4th French Army, he will then begin visiting the headquarters. He does not have orders at the time to really determine where the 2nd Division will be employed. So he goes to 4th Army headquarters and he'll start to inquire of the staff and, of course, General Gouraud as well. General Gouraud is an interesting or fascinating general in the French Army. He's a colonial general. He probably would have been wearing a khaki uniform, not the horizon blue, so that kind of made him stand out. He had lost an arm from wounds received in the Dardanelles or at Gallipoli. He's a well-known, well-respected, and formidable combat commander. Certainly would have had respect from anybody who served with him or had seen him and the awards on his chest, no doubt. General Lejeune then will indeed meet with him at headquarters on 27 September. And it's interesting because General Lejeune actually gives an account of his meeting with him when he's actually afforded the opportunity to sit and discuss the employment of the 4th Army. And I will quote General Lejeune's comment. And he notes that General Gouraud places his hand on a map that outlines a ridge lying between Medea Farm and Blanc Mont. And General Gouraud emphatically states, if I could take this position by assault, advance beyond it to the vicinity of the St. Etienne and the Arne River, I would be able to break the German defense and they'd be forced to evacuate Notre-Dame-des-Champs. And then I would be able to free the city of Reims. He then paused and noted, however, my divisions, they are worn out from the long strain of continuous fighting and from the effects of the heavy casualties they have suffered. And it is doubtful that they are now equal to accomplish this difficult task, unless they are heavily reinforced. General Lejeune quotes or goes on to say, I quickly answered with deliberation, General, if you do not divide the 2nd Division, but put it in line as a unit on a narrow front, I am confident that it will be able to take Blanc Mont Ridge, advance beyond it, and hold its position there. That was certainly written after the war. It probably is a very accurate account, at least the dialogue in general. Certainly Lejeune's giving himself compliments in quickly devising a plan. I would assume his staff or Colonel Ellis at the time had a part in developing the plan. But what it's referring to is that really Pershing's greatest fear, and it did happen, and General Lejeune was determined not to let it happen. A U.S. infantry division was twice the size of a French division, and so Gouraud certainly had thoughts of breaking the 2nd Division in half and assigning its brigades separately to French divisions. That might have been a ploy by Gouraud to see or test Lejeune's moral strength, if you will, but certainly Lejeune passed that test. And after several days of deliberation, General Nolan, who is the 21st Corps commander, General Nolan, will meet with Lejeune and say his plan is accepted. And they will then talk over the day as to what, well, actually it'll be a day and a half, what will be then the division plan to breach the Hindenburg line atop Blanc Mont Ridge. And it will really be, if you can say, a flank attack up onto the ridgetop, 2 brigades, and with 2 regiments leading, with 2 regiments then following.
All right, we're going to talk about the battle itself in just a minute. But first, the 2nd Division has something called the 20% rule. What is this?
Oh yeah. This is kind of eyebrow raising. So when John and I first learned about this, I was like, whoa, this seems like an odd decision. But it's not that uncommon for armies to do things like this in the First World War. So the 2nd Division has suffered horrific casualties at Belleau Wood and again at Soissons. And so they keep receiving replacement battalions. Replacement battalions were 1,000 strong. The brigade's 8,000 strong. And by the end of Soissons, they probably suffered well over 100% of their unit strength and casualties at different times. And what they're trying to do is maintain their status as an experienced veteran organization. But that's really hard when you're suffering 50, 60% casualties in an engagement. So in August, the division says, okay, what we're going to do from now on is we're going to leave out 1/5 of our infantrymen and our machine gunners. So we're just going to have them sit it out. And that seems so weird that you would leave. That's your combat power. You're leaving 1/5 of your combat power out of a battle, but they had to take the long view, and they had to say, our job is not just to win this battle. Our job is to win every fight we're going to get into. And everybody expected in August, the Americans generally expected in 1918 that the war was going to go well into 1919. So they had to preserve the division as an effective organization for another year or two. So the idea is we're going to take a cadre of experienced veterans to rebuild the unit after each fight. So we maintain that cohesion that's so important. So all this training and all this experience that we've accumulated up to now won't be wasted because all the guys who know what they're doing are going to be killed or injured and not available to train the new replacements coming in. Well, what the effect of this though is like you can measure this is for the 2nd Division in Blanc Mont. That's 3,400 infantrymen and machine gunners that are going to be left out of the fight. They'll be doing things like working parties, helping out at the hospitals, maybe serving as, command post guards or runners or things like that. They're not just going to be going on leave or something, but still, that leaves. Now, when we plan battles in the military, we try and estimate, well, what's our relative combat power against their relative combat power? Well, the Americans didn't really know how many Germans are facing, but they had generally a pretty good idea. And the 2nd Division is only going to have 13,500 riflemen and machine gunners going up against a German strength of probably around 5,000. So that's less than a 3-to-1 advantage in infantry. Depending on how you count it, they're probably equally matched in artillery, although the Americans and the French have a lot more ammunition, which is really important when you're calculating how much artillery power you have. But still, I mean, we're attacking Germans in fortified positions. We're going uphill. We've got a long way to go, and we've only got a 2.5-to-1 advantage in infantry strength and about 1-to-1 in artillery. That could be considered a high-risk operation. Depending on how you look at it. So not a negligible practice, but one they thought was that important.
Yeah, when I read about that, I thought it was a very interesting solution, but also potentially a problem. Let's get into the battle itself now. Can you gentlemen give us an overview of the battle?
Yeah, let me start and talk about how it starts, and then after I get tired of talking, I'll try and relinquish it to John. So the battle starts on the morning, very early in the morning of 3 October, and it's a little bit cold, and it's still a little bit dark. The sun is just coming up at dawn, and it's foggy. It's really foggy, which is really going to help. And the troops up front, it's the 2nd Battalion of the 6th Marine Regiment are going to lead this attack, are in these captured German trenches that the French and then later they had overrun and taken away as a jumping off position. So now they've got a little distance before they're going to hit the first German positions. They're probably about 600 meters away from any Germans in front of them. And they know they're probably going to attack really soon, but they haven't yet received the order because it was such an agonizingly slow process in World War I to develop a plan and get it down to the frontline troops in time for them to prepare for the attack, because there's so many complicated details that have to be worked out. And of course, how are we doing all this? Well, we're doing it pen to paper, and then we're typing it up on mimeograph sheets, and then the mimeograph sheets are handed out to the runners who jump on motorcycles, go down to the next echelon. So it goes from the French Corps and it gets to the Americans. And by the way, we have to translate it from French into English, and then we have to say, okay, this is how we're going to do it. And then motorcycles take it down to the brigade, and then motorcycles take it down to the regiment. And then finally, runners show up at the lead battalion's position, and they're already working on their plan because they haven't got the order yet, and they're thinking we're probably going to have to attack today, and they didn't have time to pass the word. So some of the platoon commanders claimed that, hey, the first I knew we were attacking was the artillery bombardment started across our front, and we figured this must be the attack. So the lead battalion gets all their lieutenants and sergeants, start getting the Marines out of their bunkers and get up into their attack formation. And because the barrage is what we call a rolling barrage, they had some time to get themselves sorted out and get into their attack formation. So because they're professional and they're experienced and they're well led, this inability to get the order down to the frontline battalion doesn't blow the attack. So the way we're going to attack today, it's really interesting. It's not the way that we kind of think of attacking in modern tactics, but we're going to line up one battalion in front of the other. All 6 battalions of the Marine Brigade, the 3 battalions of the 6th Marines are going to lead, and then they're going to be followed by the 3 battalions of the 5th Marines, all in like a big formation with the 1 battalion up front, and then 1,000 meters back will be another battalion, then 1,000 meters back will be another battalion, and so on and so on. And we're going to attack on a very narrow front. And that narrow front is going to be covered by this rolling barrage. All these 75 millimeter guns from the 12th Artillery of the 2nd Division are going to be shooting their high explosive. They're going to be shooting shrapnel right in front of the Marines, and they're going to be attacking. And the Marines know they need to hug this barrage so close that it's going to suppress the Germans. It's going to keep them pinned down in their holes and in their bunkers while the Marines advance up. Now, if that barrage starts moving too fast and the Marines can't keep up with it, they're going to lose the protection of that barrage. And then the Germans are going to come out of their holes and they're going to man their machine guns and they're going to annihilate the Marines. So the Marines got to stay close to it. So close that some of them probably got hurt from friendly artillery fire. So what we do in order to keep that barrage from running away from the attacking infantry is it's got to move slowly. So it's only going to move 100 meters every 4 minutes. So think about that. If you walk outside your house, and I'm just going to walk 100 meters, you can walk 100 meters in less than a minute. So that gives them a little bit of time to stay. And what they've also got is they've got 4 companies online, each one of them 250 Marines, and they're all very motivated. They're all kind of excited and enthusiastic. And as an additional protection for them, they've got French artillery shooting smoke rounds just on the far side of this artillery barrage. So it kind of obscures the Marines from the German observers up the hill of Blanc Mont. So they're not really visible by the German artillery spotters, and it gives them an additional amount of protection. So they're advancing up. They hit this first outpost line. It's kind of a thin line, probably no more than a few hundred German infantry that about 600 meters to the front, and the lead Marine battalion quickly overwhelms them, keeps moving up the ridge. And this is a long ridge. Like when you're sitting at the base of the ridge and you look up, the Marines could see the summit of Blanc Mont, and it was over 3 miles away. And we're going to do this all in just a little over 2 hours. But they keep advancing up the ridge. And one thing that this artillery barrage does that's so neat is that in addition to suppressing the Germans and protecting the Marines as they move up, is it tells everybody in the Marine ranks, this is the way to go. This is how fast to go. So it's like a control measure that's moving across the battlefield, saying this way, keep moving. And so the Marines just kind of start crowding up against the barrage line. And many times there's reports of them capturing up to like 40 Germans in a bunker downstairs. The Marines come up and the Germans are still cowering down in their bunkers because their artillery just got done blasting over and they weren't really sure it was done. And the Marines will throw a few grenades down there and say, rouse, rouse. And holy crow, we just captured 40 of them. We didn't have to kill them. We didn't have to fight them. They're all gone. And they keep moving up. And there's some really neat things in there. There's a private. He never gets promoted because he gets in trouble so much, named John Kelly from Chicago. And he runs through the barrage with just grenades and a .45 pistol because he wants to be the first one to capture a German machine gun. And he does it. And he throws a grenade, takes out the machine gun post, captures a couple Germans, and he marches them back through the barrage and past his company commander, because he's just so excited to be there. And he's only a runner. He's not even supposed to be out there fighting. And you have another guy named John Pruitt, who's one of these guys that he just takes out a German machine gun nest with his marksmanship, and then he runs up and he captures another 40 Germans almost single-handedly that are down inside a bunker. And pretty soon, The lead battalion finds itself on top of Blanc Mont Ridge. When I say pretty soon, I know exactly how long it took them to get there. 2 hours and 8 minutes, because that's how long it took the barrage to move up the hill. And the Marines are now there. It's a spectacular feat. They've advanced 6 kilometers in 2 hours. Now, the whole time, though, the Germans off to their west had been shooting machine gun fire from the west into their ranks. And there was a place that the Marines called the Essen Hook, and it's like a piece of high ground. That Essen trench the Marines are occupying, where they jump off from, is still in German hands off to their left-hand side. And it's a German machine gun position. And so these Germans are shooting long range, not close, not like 50 meters or 100 meters, but like 500, 1,000 meters. They're shooting into the Marine ranks. So as each battalion passes by the Essen Hook, as it leaves the trench, it gets a dose of machine gun fire from the left, until toward the end, the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, the last battalion in the 6th Battalion column, has the job of taking out the Essen Hook. So they go over, they take the Essen Hook, they capture it in a really brilliant fight by the 17th Company, supported by machine guns and 37 millimeter cannons. But then they start to reorganize themselves. They hand that sector back over to the French, and the French lose the Essen Hook in a German counterattack, and the Germans kind of infiltrate behind the Marines about halfway up in a German position called the Saddleberg. And then, because remember I told you that the lead battalion commander didn't really get the order until the last minute? Well, he's not really sure or understanding that the summit of Blanc Mont off to his left, which is the topographical crest of this hill, is part of his job. And so he's reached this road, this east-west road at the top, and he's organizing his defense, but that's still in German hands. And so the Germans counterattack and infiltrate and take that. So they've got a little bit of high ground off to the Marines' left flank. So if they think about it, at the end of the 3rd October, the Marines have this really, really, really long penetration into the German lines. And they're on the summit of Blanc Mont. But the Germans still hold everything off to the west, from where they started to where they stopped. And they're getting counterattacked, and they're getting direct fire from rifles and machine guns and artillery from the west and from the northwest and from the north and from the northeast. Their only secure flank is the right, where the U.S. Army's 3rd Brigade, also part of the 2nd Division, has also advanced and linked up with them. So they really actually do a magnificent job for the first 2 hours, take the key terrain, and then they spend the rest of the day trying to reorganize their defense. And meanwhile, they're suffering casualties from long-range machine gun and artillery fire from 3 directions. And I think I have exhausted myself, and I'm going to turn it over to my good friend John to talk about what happens next.
So before we get to 4 October, to close out 3 October, it's success. Maybe not complete success, but it is success. They have begun to penetrate the Hindenburg Line. Again, to note what Pete noted, the French have not been able to keep pace with the Marines' assault. To be fair, the ridge that they're assigned to take is much steeper and much more costly to take. So 5th Marines will take the lead. They will leapfrog, and they'll be ordered to assume the attack on the morning of the 4th. But before we leave the 3rd, this success is known by Marshal Falk, and that night there'll be an order issued to resume the attack. And the 21st Corps order will state Marshal Falk has just learned of the success of the 21st Corps, and in particular, the American 2nd Division attached to it. He personally directs that this success be exploited to the limit. All must press forward at once without hesitation. The breach is made. The enemy must not be given time to repair it. Interestingly enough, the Germans know this, and the Americans, the Marines in particular, really now moved into what will become very adept to German tactics in the defense, the elastic defense, if you will. And so the Germans are actually preparing their counterattack. And interestingly enough, as a historical footnote, the German counterattack will actually start at 4 o'clock in the morning. Coincidentally enough, the 5th Marines are ordered to assume their attack at 6 o'clock on the morning of the 4th. So how that attack unfolds on the German side is at roughly 04, the German barrage begins to land on the summit of Blanc Mont, just as the 5th Marine Regiment is trying to uncoil itself and get into its attack formation and press into its attack at 6 o'clock. In many of the personal accounts, the Marines are confused, thinking that this is either their barrage that's falling short, or indeed they're thinking the Germans are beginning to counterattack. The German counterattack is actually unfolding from St. Etienne. The Marines can't see it. It's still dark. And as the Germans start to counterattack, they're going to stop at the Saddleberg position, which is just south of St. Etienne and north of Blanc Mont. They're going to hold there, and there's basically 3 German regiments that are converging to this point. They'll get there at about 06, just as the Marines are starting their attack. The 5th Marine Regiment have already begun to take casualties. They will attack in a column of battalions, with the 3rd Battalion leading. 3rd Battalion as led by Major Larson, 2nd Battalion in support as led by Major Messersmith, and then the 1st Battalion in reserve led by Major Hamilton. So Major Larson moves out with 2 companies abreast and then 2 companies in support. He's got about 3 kilometers to go. As he starts to go down this little swale, if you will, he then becomes deluged, if you will, from German artillery as it starts to walk its way back to the German counterattack position. While he's doing this, as Pete noted, there are still German defensive positions intact on Blanc Mont. So as the 5th Marines begin to attack, they're taking fire from the front, from the western flank, and also the further they penetrate from the rear. The German intent of the counterattack was to actually cut off the salient that the Marines had formed. The Marines' mission is to extend that salient, if you will. It takes them about 3 hours, about 9 to 9:30, where the 1st Battalion is deployed. 2nd Battalion is moving up to literally now, because of the artillery fire, the 3rd and 2nd Battalions have begun to compress as they start to get up the ridge line. The Germans begin to fall back, and that is actually a depth for them because they have that 3rd main line of resistance just outside of St. Etienne, and it will look up the slope of the Saddleberg position. And then as the 3rd and 2nd Battalions crest, they will just be inundated with both artillery and machine gun fire, both from their front, their left flank, and from the rear. At that time, the attack stalls. There are accounts of small squads or platoons trying to attack further, and it simply disintegrates. Sometime between noon and 1 o'clock, Major Hamilton, with his 1st Battalion, will have entered the swale, and he will see what's going on, and he will see off to his west another German regiment beginning to counterattack to cut off the penetration. He will take that opportunity to bring his battalion in line, and he will basically sweep as a door on a hinge, sweep west and then north to get to the top of the Saddleberg position. So the accounts are replete with the acts of courage that unfold on that day. At the end, though, it's always interesting to note really the personal accounts of what really becomes the Marines' most horrific day in World War I, for which 4 October is known. And of course, my favorite author, and then the Marine who was actually there, Private Elton E. Mackin, a tremendous writer, a survivor, and I always go back to some of his quotes, but this one is very powerful. Years later, in the 1920s, as he began to recollect back on the day of 4 October, he left us with these stunning words. He noted, "The men were stunned, lashed down to earth by flailing whips of shrapnel, gas, and heavy stuff that came as drum fire. It killed them. There is no place in our little world for us to go. The fellows bunched against the fancied shelter of larger trees in little close-packed knots, like storm-swept sheep, and that's how they died. They died that way in those groups." So 4 October is a footnote, really, in Marine Corps history. The 5th Marine Regiment will really cease to exist after 4 October. The regiment as a whole will take some 1,200 casualties that day. That's just the 5th Marine Regiment. As a note, the bloodiest day of 6 June at Belleau Wood, the entire 4th Marine Brigade took just over 1,000 casualties. 5th Marines will not really get enough replacements before the end of the war. And when they cross the Meuse on the night of the 10th, there'll be some just under 500 men remaining. It is indeed the bloodiest day, as we note in Marine Corps history. Interestingly enough, the morning of 4 October, the Germans will receive the order to begin abandoning their positions and retreat north. And that kind of leaves us with what was Blanc Mont. So indeed, on 4 October, the Hindenburg line is broken. It is pierced. And the attack will continue for another 4 days as the 36th Infantry Division will assume it. But on 4 October, the Germans understand that their defense is broken. They will have the order to move on. And what's interesting enough also is that will be the day that the Germans will actually begin discussions to sue for peace, which we know will not happen for.
A number of Marines received the Medal of Honor or the Distinguished Service Cross for their actions there. Can you tell us about some of these men?
Absolutely. So really the foundation or the fabric of Marine Corps lore, heritage, and traditions. Pete noted Private Kelly, just a little interesting note. Lore would state that Kelly turns to his company commander, Private Kelly. He is a company runner. It is noted that he turns to his company commander just before the attack starts, and he holds his 45 caliber pistol, and he says, "I'm going to be the first in the unit to capture a machine gun," and he will run through the barrage. And again, the Germans are on a reverse slope defense. So as a barrage crests this little hillock, he'll run through the barrage, past the hillock. He'll disappear for some 30 minutes. The next thing they know, he comes back through the fog leading a squad of German prisoners and a machine gun, and he will receive the Medal of Honor. It's an interesting account. Please feel free to look it up as to how and what formation he receives that Medal of Honor from General Pershing himself. A private of Marines will be in the audience of several U.S. Army generals receiving their awards. And one of the Army generals will look at the private and say, "You must be in the wrong formation. What medal are you to receive?" And Private Kelly will look at him and say, "Sir, I'm here to receive the Medal of Honor." At which time the U.S. Army general said, I apologize, sir." We spoke of Corporal Pruitt, who received the Medal of Honor for capturing some 40 Germans. A little bit of historical note, he was born on October 4th. He will conduct that valorous act on October 3rd. On October 4th, his birthday, he will be killed in the artillery barrage that morning. He will die on his birthday. The other one is actually a sailor. He'll later become Dr. Bulsh. He enlists in the Navy from Kansas City, Missouri. He'll be a corpsman attached to 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines. His valorous acts will be resulting in the Medal of Honor award for what he's done at Soissons, and then also at Blanc Mont in rescuing wounded Marines. So those are three. Certainly ask you to read the book. There are certainly several Army Medals of Honor that are given. And then also Pete wrote a very important historical note in the monograph about the 78th Company, where both Kelly and Pruitt were members. But there will also then be 13 Distinguished Service Crosses given for that one day of action for that company. So it's a fascinating historical note to read.
It certainly is. So what is next for the 4th Brigade, and what does the taking of Blanc Mont open up for the Allies going forward?
It really is a stunning success. And I know we kind of painted a picture where we talked about the heavy casualties, we talked about the missteps, we talked about things that did not go well for the Marines in the 2nd Division. But that's what combat's like. And victory is not pretty in most cases. It's a stunning success because the 2nd Division has taken Blanc Mont. The French 4th Army can seize this entire series of hills, an east-west chain called Les Monts, which means that the Germans now have to withdraw behind the Aisne River. And N is spelled A-I-S-N-E. For those people like me who don't speak French well, it's pronounced N, which means that the city of Reims, R-H-E-I-M-S, Rem, that the city of Reims is now free. But even more importantly to Foch, the Germans are now withdrawing. They're withdrawing in front of the 4th Army, which means that Pershing's now got an easier time in the Argonne, pushing the Germans back in front of him. And it's putting all this pressure, and the Germans are quickly reaching their culminating point. Their generals are already talking about, we really need to have an armistice here. So it's a major contribution. The Marines themselves, they still have one more fight, though. So the Argonne had not gone very well for the 1st U.S. Army. The AEF is then split into two armies, and the Marines and the 2nd Division join it and join in the attack there on 1 November. They come in at a good time. The Germans have been worn down pretty badly, and along with several other American units are able to make a spectacular breakthrough. But at the same time that they're doing this, the weather gets really bad and supplies get really fouled up. And so the Marines and the doughboys in the 2nd Division are suffering from cold and wet and mud and hunger much more than they're suffering from German fire in the Argonne. And then they get, as they're weak and they're exhausted and they're hungry, they get hit by the influenza epidemic of 1918. So by the 10 November, Marine Corps birthday, they're poised on the banks of the Meuse River to force their way across. The armistice is coming. The armistice gets signed at 11 o'clock the following morning, but Pershing continues the assault, directs the 2nd Division to attack, and the 5th Marines lose a lot more pointless casualties on the last night of the war there, trying to cross they do successfully cross the Meuse River. So that's kind of the rest of the war for the Marines in the 2nd Division.
I would note, Amanda, that what he just spoke to really encapsulates the final query, or one of the final queries was it's actually Marshal Pétain who was quoted as saying the greatest single achievement of the 1918 campaign and in the Battle of Liberation was the taking of Blanc Mont. I think what Pete just attested to really clarifies as to why he probably made that comment. It really was the beginning of the inception of seeing the end of the war.
When I was doing some background research, I came across a statement from a retired general officer, and he was basically saying the same thing, that it was an incredible contribution to the war and to ending the war. If that is the case, then why is this battle largely forgotten or just overlooked?
Let me take a crack at that first, and then John, you share your thoughts. But operationally, I think that statement is pretty accurate. I think the 2nd Division, because it was the singular contributing unit to the victory at Blanc Mont, and Blanc Mont was so important that you could definitely make the argument that Blanc Mont was the 2nd Division's greatest contribution of the war operationally. I think you could make an equally valid argument that their contribution at Soissons during that massive counterattack in July, where the Allies turned the tide, was also very operationally significant, but maybe less of a contribution to 2nd Division, only because they were one of maybe 25 divisions in that counterattack, even though they may have been one of the most important ones and one of the most successful divisions. But I think when you talk about Belleau Wood, the importance is not so much operational. The German offensive had pretty much petered out. The Marines did not save Paris by defeating the Germans at Belleau Wood. But psychologically, in 1918, the information war, the Allied morale, the Allied soldiers' morale, and the German soldiers' morale were all impacted by the Marine victory at Belleau Wood and the 2nd Division's service there, because it was the first major action Americans that came in. It was a very difficult one. It was a very challenging one. It was in all the newspapers, and they came out triumphant. And that was a huge morale boost. And morale matters a lot. You know, countries lose wars. Countries collapse in World War I because their morale collapses, and they have revolutions like in Russia, like to a degree in Germany, and the Allies came close in places like the French army mutinying in certain regiments in 1917. So morale is extremely important. And so the psychological victory of Belleau Wood is certainly an important contribution to the 2nd Division. And when I talk to Marine audiences, the message I try and get to them is World War I is a lot more important to the Marine Corps than the Marine Corps is to World War I. And what I mean by that is, as part of the Marine Corps' history, as part of a defining moment in its history, where it emerges from almost being an unknown organization to being considered this elite fighting force and the force in readiness for the country, Belleau Wood really makes that happen. Belleau Wood makes the Marine Corps of the 20th century what it is. But the Marine Brigade's contribution to the outcome of World War I probably didn't shorten it by a single day. And then John, that's my opinion.
It's hard to add to that eloquence. I would just go back to really the first person accounts. For those who survived Blanc Mont, it looms large in the literature and what notes are taken from the historical record. I think oftentimes when we study battles, we focus on the battle and we forget the campaigns or the war. Where you look at the trajectory of the Marines' involvement in World War I, where Blanc Mont falls, it's the next to last battle that they'll participate in. And it's not so much as forgotten, it's just overcome or subsumed by either Belleau Wood or the continued spectrum up through the end of the war. We forget that the Marines are actually engaged in almost every 30 days for 6 months in a major battle. Very few are alive or in the ranks by the time either the Army of Occupation or let alone at the Meuse Crossing. So everyone will recollect a different battle that looms large in their memory. But certainly Belleau Wood, though, is the touch point. It's the first engagement. The rest of them are not so well known. But I do think Blanc Mont has great significance, really, and not just the historical record, but also the legend of the Marine Corps.
Any final thoughts?
Well, I think hopefully we've inspired a couple of people listening to want to go out and get the book. One of the best things about the book is the price. It's free if you want to download an electronic copy. And what you do is you go to the Marine Corps History Division Publications website at usmcu.edu. That's usmcu.edu. And also you can download the PDF copy of the book, or you can contact the History Division. They have a little form you can fill out online, and you can ask them to pretty please send you a hard copy of the book. And usually they will do that if they've got enough of them in stock. And again, the name of the book is A Hideous Price. And if you'll indulge me, I want to quote from John W. Thomason. This is the passage where John and I drew the title. And John was talking about how October 4 was the bloodiest day in Marine Corps history. And we talked about all the sacrifice of all these Marines and doughboys at Blanc Mont. And John Thomason was one of those young officers who was in the 5th Marines on 4 October and went through that frightful experience that John was talking about. And in his book, Fixed Bayonets, he wrote, "In ragged column of twos, unsightly even in the dim and fitful light, the Marines plodded down the other side. They were utterly weary, with shuffling feet and hanging heads. The division had just done something remarkable. They had hurled the Boche from Blanc Mont and freed the sacred city of Rheims. They had paid a price hideous even for this war." We love John Thomason. He was an inspiring officer in the First World War, a great historian, and a great author of literature as well.
Thomason is truly my touch point for all things Great War for the Marine Corps. And interesting enough, so Pete and I did not rehearse this, but I too was going in with a quote to another person who you always have to give voice to. Of course, I always go back to Elton Mackin. Private Mackin left us with a quote that is just as harrowing when you think about what this man faced. A member of the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. He wrote, "The battalion had come back from Blanc Mont Ridge. Now the battalion was still up there. 134 of us had come back from Blanc Mont Ridge. We had gone up a full-strength battalion, 1,000 strong. The men were shocked and dazed and walked about with queer expressions. One saw expectancy and eagerness of welcome die on a stricken face. It wasn't him. He wasn't there. He was still up on the ridge." Again, the publication is free. I would take a moment, though. I have to thank Pete. He really motivated me to do this. Blanc Mont has always been a fascination of mine. It stemmed from a footnote. Really, my thanks to George Clark, who really is the godfather of all Great War histories relating to the Marine Brigade. There's an interesting footnote he made about 4 October, and I spent years trying to research where he had gotten that information from, and it really led to almost a decade of us really putting some of this information forth in this publication. I'll only give the first names after thanking Pete and George, but some other people that certainly deserve it of our thanks, professionalism. Annette, Wild Bill, Bill Anderson, Steve Gerard, and many others, but certainly not much to Pete.
Yeah, Lieutenant Colonel Wild Bill Cody did our maps, and even if you don't think anything of what we wrote, the maps alone are worth downloading a copy. They're beautiful, and they will add so much clarity to our understanding of this battle. So Richard Wild Bill Cody is a map maker extraordinaire.
Yeah, he truly brings a narrative to life that lends a great piece to historical record of really portraying what truly happened over the terrain. Very talented man.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov.